All right, welcome back, everybody. Now let's get to politics and your money. Senator Elizabeth Warren's rise in the poll grabbing the attention of many on Wall Street. Here's investor Ron Barron on Squawk Box on Friday.
I don't think that Elizabeth Warren would be successful in getting, it doesn't matter how many people are going to be elected or Democrats, she's not going to be successful if she were chosen president as in getting through the policies that she's proposing. I think they're pretty nuts.
Joining us right now is Gabriel Zucman. He helped design some of those policies, including Senator Warren's tax plan, and is the co-author of the book Triumph of Injustice: How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Also with us this morning is Andy Puzder. He's former CKE Restaurants CEO. And gentlemen, it's good to see both of you.
Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. Gabriel, that was Ron Barron on Friday. He doesn't think that these proposals would ever make it through. What is your answer to that? What's the feedback that you've gotten since the book came out?
Yeah, well, people said the same thing of the federal income tax before 1913, that it would never work, it would never be a reality, that people would evade it, that it would be bad for the economy and for jobs and so on. And, now we know that it's a big success, it's working very well. So the wealth tax could work well. Wealth concentration has increased a lot in the U.S. The top 0.1% wealthiest Americans own about 20% of U.S. wealth. So there's a ton of wealth at the top, and their tax rate currently is not high. The 400 wealthiest Americans pay only 23% of their income in taxes, and so the most direct way to make them pay more is through a wealth tax.
Take it away.
Can I ask you a question? Because you've been advising Elizabeth Warren on these issues to some degree. Does she want to take money away from the wealthiest because she wants to redistribute, or does she want to take wealth away from the wealthiest because she sees this as a larger inequality story? If you were to get inside her brain?
I can't talk for her. I'm not involved in any campaign, in any official position. And, there's a trade-off. If you have a high tax rate, then you reduce inequality a lot, and you don't collect a lot of revenue in the long run. If you have a more moderate wealth tax, you do less to reduce wealth concentration, but you can sustainably collect quite a lot of money that can be spent on child care, on health care, on student debt.
But how much of this for her is about raising revenue versus this sort of some people would describe it as a social engineering project as well?
She's more in terms of the rates that she proposes. They are quite what I would call moderate wealth tax rates. 2% above 50 million, 3% above 1 billion.
Andy, your thoughts on the wealth tax?
Well, first of all, with the income tax, I think it's a good comparison. When the income tax started, the idea was that only the wealthy would be taxed. About 10% of the taxpayers were taxed. By 1940, it was everybody was filing a tax return. And that's the same thing with this wealth tax. It's only supposed to be on the wealthy now, but you got to be some kind of naive to think that we all won't be subject to a wealth tax over time if this thing takes place. So I think it's a terrible idea, number one. Number two, I think it will discourage economic growth. I'm more of a John Kennedy, the economic tide lifts all boats. We want to generate economic growth. So I think things that encourage investment, that encourage people to invest, are the way to really lift people from the bottom to the top. And as far as taxes, we've got the top 10% of wage earners pay 70% of taxes. The top 50% pay 97% of taxes. We have a very progressive tax system. We're seeing people from the bottom being lifted up. You look at wage growth over the past 14 months for production and non-supervisory employees, in other words, workers, have been up over 3% for 14 consecutive months with the economic growth under President Trump. They were up 3.5% last month. So we've got real growth. It's harder to find a blue-collar worker than a white-collar worker. The current population survey showed that economic inequality decreased statistically significantly last year when you take into account the size of households. So we're seeing the kind of things you'd like to see. The poor are getting richer and the rich are getting richer. I don't think that wealth is a zero-sum game where the rich only get richer if the poor get poorer and vice versa. So I think we're on a good track now. I hope we can continue this track and continue to grow the economy.
Gabriel, with the wealth tax, you take 2% away every year. Cumulatively, that adds up over several years, and you're talking about a pretty big number. Why, if you're concerned about the wealthy, why don't you just focus on capital gains? Because that's the reason a lot of the wealthiest pay much less money, because they are collecting more from their stock investments or other investments than they are from ordinary income, and that's taxed at a lower rate.
Yeah, well, I think you should do both. Have a more progressive income tax and higher capital gains taxation and a wealth tax. And the reason why the income tax is not enough is because when you're extremely rich, you can own a lot of wealth while realizing and reporting very little taxable income. So you take Warren Buffett, for instance. He's worth $80 billion, but his company, Berkshire Hathaway, doesn't pay dividends, and so he just sells a few shares every year and realizes a bit of capital gains, maybe $10, $20 million. He pays 20, 23% on that,
right.
And his effective tax rate, like 2-3 million in taxes paid divided by his true economic income, which is something like 6% times his wealth, $5 billion, is essentially 0%.
And you're talking about people who are founders. If you look at a Warren Buffett or a Jeff Bezos or someone, those are people who are founders who are trying to keep control of the company. What you would do is effectively force them to sell shares and lose control of the company. You force them to sell shares. They then have to pay taxes on that on top of it.
Plus, gradually, taxes. Yes. You do eventually pay taxes on those gains. You pay capital gains tax at some point, or you pay estate tax when you die. So it's not that money isn't taxed. It is taxed. It's just when is it taxed?
But by the way, I don't disagree with you. But the issue to me,
that's good to hear. Okay, it happens so rarely.
But then the question is, okay. So to me, you can solve a lot of your problems that you're talking about by changing the step-up basis on at the end of life. That's a huge component of it. Yeah. Possibly changing even, and I don't know where you stand on philanthropy, but that's a huge component because if you're going to give all your money away, to some degree you could argue that myself as a taxpayer is effectively subsidizing those who are giving the money away. I don't know where you land on that. I would like to encourage a lot of philanthropy. Maybe there's a limit. I don't know. You got 1031 exchanges. You got carried interest. You could go. You could do something on capital gains if you wanted to in a progressive way. The question is, why wouldn't you go after what I would call all those things low-hanging fruit relative to a larger wealth tax?
But again, I think you want to do both, and you take the case of Mark Zuckerberg.
Both becomes complicated.
Well, look at Mark Zuckerberg. Your argument is let's wait for him to pay the estate tax. It's going to be in 50 years or 60 years.
Right. Okay.
It's too long. Right now, he's not paying much in taxes just because Facebook doesn't pay dividends and the corporate income tax has almost.
But I have no idea what's going to happen to Facebook. But what happens if I told you that? What happens if I told you that in 20 or 30 years from now, Facebook, I hope it's not worthless, but let's say it turns into, he would be very upset for me saying this, it turns into Kodak or MySpace or something of that sort. So you're saying he should pay taxes on what it's worth today, even if later he's left with nothing. And
he should pay taxes today because he is extremely wealthy, doesn't pay much tax, and this is money that can fund.
But he can't spend it otherwise.
That was successful.
This is being cash poor. This is not like he may have created wealth, but he can't use the wealth.
Of course he can. He can borrow money if he wants. He can give to charities. I mean, there are lots of ways when you're worth $50 billion to spend whatever you want. So if he wants to spend,
I'm
he can
not
spend.
suggesting he's cash poor either.
He's not cash poor. Yeah.
So look. Becky was right. If you have a 2% tax for 25 years on somebody's wealth, that's 40% of their wealth that goes away. Who's going to stay in the country if you can do that? This is why 12 countries in Europe had a wealth tax in 1990, and 3 have it today. It doesn't work. People leave. It's hard to enforce. It's hard to calculate the wealth. What you would do is you would encourage people to buy assets that didn't have a market. In other words, you can value stocks, so you can say what they're worth. If you're rich, what you're going to invest in is things where you can argue with the government about what your money's worth, or you're going to leave the country. This has terrible economic ripples. You'll destroy economic growth. You'll take the most successful nation in the history of the world, and you'll make it France or Venezuela. We don't want to do that.
Or you'll just make it like the U.S. from the 1950s and 1980s. From the 50s to
there
the
was
80s,
no wealth tax in the 50s and 80s.
You had a 50% corporate tax.
But nobody paid it.
50%
the rich people didn't pay it.
Oh, corporations did pay it.
They didn't pay it. They had incredible exemptions.
No, for the corporate tax. I'm not talking about the individual.
So you want to take those corporate inversions that we're driving companies back to Ireland again.
50% corporate tax.
This just doesn't make economic sense.
90% top income tax rate, 80% estate tax rate, and growth was 2.2% a year.
Nobody paid the high rate.
Since 1990, growth has been 1.1% a year, with much lower corporate tax rates.
Can I ask you a question about that argument? Because you've made this sort of inequality argument, which is to say that actually if you were to tax people more and there'd be more redistribution of wealth, that you actually think that would create growth, is what I've heard from you in a way.
It can have a small positive effect.
And my question is, when you look at the 1950s, 60s, 70s as these sort of baseline cases that you're running against, and I've said this on the show a lot, during that period, the rest of the world was out of business. So we were a monopoly power in the United States with monopoly rents. You got to 1980 when wages started to stagnate. What happened? The rest of the world all of a sudden came online. They're now competing with us. Germany, Japan, all of them are now back in business. And then you're playing against a global competitive field in a way that didn't exist before.
No, it's a good argument. But what I would say is one of the big lessons from economic history is that what makes countries wealthy is not low tax rates on the rich. It's investment in education, in health, in infrastructure, in the public goods and services that make communities prosperous. And the U.S., to some extent, did that from the 50s to the 80s.
Now the issue is we're not spending
less.
enough. We're not spending enough now.
Yeah, look
so
at
we don't have enough revenue.
Look at the tax to GDP ratio. It has declined by 4 points since the late 1990s. So there's a real revenue problem.
I think we need more revenue because we need to spend more money. The question is, how do you get that? How do you get that revenue?
How do you get the revenue without discouraging the growth that creates the revenue, which is exactly what would happen if we implemented these plans. You put in a wealth tax, the growth that creates more tax revenue disappears. You become like any other socialist country. You become a no-growth, oppressive state where the government promises everything and provides nothing.
You distribute a smaller pie more fairly.
Yeah, you want to instead of growing the economic pie, you want more equal, smaller pieces. Well, It makes no sense.
Well, by the way, it made sense for the U.S.
Not this country, it doesn't.
Debt? What do you make about the debt load? So I have a great fear of the amount of debt that this country has taken on. But there's others in the sort of economic world these days who actually think that debt can be unlimited.
Yeah, I mean, for the wealth tax, it's irrelevant. You borrow, your assets increase.
My question is, do you plan to use the revenue to pay down the debt, or do you want to use the revenue to pay for services?
Well, a mix, I guess.
Okay. I guess it depends upon how much you're going to spend. Look, by the way, between the last year before the tax cuts, 2017 fiscal year, and this fiscal year, tax revenues are up 4.5%. Without these huge taxes. We've had it because we grew the economy. American businessmen and businesswomen invested, they grew, they hired, and we're going in the right direction.
Andy, Gabriel, I want to thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much.
We're taking on a lot of debt to do that. Coming up.